There's an image modern people rarely imagine, but for medieval peasants it was a truth that returned every single year. Waking up on a winter morning and realizing not only that your own breath was turning into mist, but that the shoes you left by the door had frozen stiff as if the earth itself was trying to keep them. The cold wasn't a sharp wind. It was a silent weight pressing down on every roof, every field, and every life or death decision. People back then understood that winter never arrived unexpectedly. It was an enemy with a clear schedule, quietly watching from autumn and waiting for the exact moment to tighten its grip on anyone who hadn't prepared enough. That's why every family entered winter the way someone steps into an exam they cannot afford to fail. The food stores had to be full, firewood stacked high like a wall against a storm, and the barn ready to shelter their livestock. Even the smallest mistake could force the entire household to pay with hunger, cold, or illness. And what made the medieval winter even more frightening was its silence. It didn't need blizzards or roaring winds. Just one night colder than usual was enough to test the endurance of an entire community. When we look at the way they prepared, we don't just see the harshness of the weather. We see the resilience of people living in an age where every single day of survival was a small victory. And if you've ever wondered whether you could make it through a winter like that, try sharing your thoughts below. You might be surprised by your own answer. For medieval peasants, preparing for winter was never a routine task. It was a survival ritual that began the moment the first leaves started to fall. They understood clearly that once the autumn sun began to weaken, every passing day was a warning that the moment snow would blanket the fields was already waiting at the door. So every family entered the preparation phase with almost absolute focus. The fields had to be harvested quickly. Every grain of barley and every bundle of rye dried, bagged, and taken down into storage before frost could ruin the entire season's work. Vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were carefully arranged in earth cellars, where stable temperatures kept them from freezing. As for meat, it had to be salted, smoked, or air-dried during the last sunny days. No one was allowed to fall behind because even a single day missed could leave the entire family hungry and cold through the long winter. At the same time, every branch of firewood was gathered and stacked into large piles because they knew nothing was more terrifying than a fire going out in the middle of a winter night. All this preparation wasn't just labor. It was a test of the family's coordination, where everyone understood that every timely action would become a shield protecting them during the freezing months ahead. When winter truly arrived and the ground hardened like stone, medieval peasants understood that wood and fire alone weren't enough to keep a house alive through the long, dark months. And this is where one of the least mentioned survival secrets appears. The presence of livestock in daily life wasn't just economic. It was a source of heat so important it could decide whether a family lived or died. Cows, sheep, chickens, even pigs were brought into small stalls built directly next to the living space, sometimes separated only by a thin wooden wall or a curtain of straw. What modern people can barely imagine is that the body heat from these animals was enough to raise the indoor temperature by several degrees. And in medieval cold, those few degrees could save a child from pneumonia or keep an elderly person from freezing to the bone. But the real twist is this. In many regions, people also burned dried manure as fuel. and poorer households relied directly on the warm air from the animal stalls to keep their roofs from freezing solid. Living with the smell, noise, and mess became a price they willingly paid, because they knew that if the animals were kept too far away, the house would cool so fast it became impossible to sleep. In that reality, livestock weren't just assets. They were living heaters, silent allies helping humans survive nights where the cold could split a water barrel in minutes. When you hear this detail, what surprises you more? Sleeping beside cows and sheep for warmth, or the fact that dried manure once saved entire generations? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes a small perspective helps us understand just how fragile life used to be. Stepping into the home of a medieval peasant in winter, the first thing modern people often misunderstand is assuming its simplicity was merely the result of poverty. But for people back then, every mud wall, every thatched roof, every wooden beam was placed exactly where it needed to be, as a final effort to hold on to whatever warmth remained in the air. Houses were usually built from wood, rubble stone, packed earth, and straw. Crude materials but easy to gather, with thick thatched roofs that kept out water and helped retain heat, yet also created the perfect environment for mold, insects, and mice to settle in. What surprises many is that even though the walls were thick, they still weren't tight enough to stop the winter wind. Just a small gap was enough for cold air to cut through and sweep away the warmth within minutes. On especially windy nights, families stuffed cracks with straw, old cloth, or even manure, because they knew a single gust at the wrong moment could drop the temperature so quickly that young children or the elderly might not make it through the night. There were even cases where roofs collapsed under the weight of heavy snow, forcing entire families to run into the livestock stall for shelter because, ironically, it was warmer and less drafty there. These designs may seem primitive, but they stand as proof of the persistence of people in the past as they tried to create a space capable of holding warmth in a world where the cold pressed against every stone and every straw of the very house they lived in. In most medieval peasant homes, the hearth wasn't tucked into a corner like we're used to seeing. It was placed right in the center of the room, a small ring of fire serving as the heart of the entire house. Yet that warmth came at a price few today can imagine. Without a proper chimney, smoke from the fire rose and lingered just below the roof, escaping slowly through a small hole at the peak of the thatched roof. This created a thick layer of smoke near the ceiling, and it was intentionally kept there because people realized it helped block cold drafts, retaining whatever warmth remained below. But this small benefit brought unavoidable consequences. The whole household coughed through the winter, children were prone to pneumonia, and adults sometimes had eyes stinging so badly they were temporarily blinded for hours, forced to sit in darkness until the smoke thinned. On especially windy days, when the smoke couldn't escape, the family had to crouch close to the floor to breathe, because only near the ground was there still some fresh air. Even so, no one dared to let the fire go out, because one night without it meant cold seeping into every fiber of flesh. The central hearth was therefore both a source of life and a challenge, one every family had to accept to survive the winter months, when even a single breath carried the scent of ash and damp. In modern imagination, a bed of dried grass may feel rustic and gentle, like something out of a folk tale. But for medieval peasants, it was a place that both kept them alive through the bitter cold and held unpleasant secrets that only those who had lived it could understand. The hay was stacked nearly 2 feet thick, forming a mattress dense enough to block the cold from the ground rising into the body. On freezing nights, it was precisely this spongy layer that preserved the fragile warmth for the entire family. Yet as the fire faded and darkness filled the room, the hay bed revealed another side of itself. One that was practical yet carried a mysterious quality that people accepted as a natural part of life. The hay was the perfect environment for mice, fleas, and small insects to hide. And it was not uncommon for someone to wake in the night from a tickling sensation on their feet or the rustle of a mouse gnawing on a forgotten chicken bone somewhere. Many families believed these sounds were signs of a house-protecting spirit patrolling, but in reality, they were traces of insects and disease. Fleas from the hay bed could even transmit illness, leaving people waking up with tiny bites all over their bodies. To keep the bed at a minimum safe level, the hay had to be replaced regularly, a laborious but necessary task, because if it became damp and rotten, it would bring a musty smell and draw cold even more strongly. Strangely, despite knowing these inconveniences, people remained attached to the hay bed as an inseparable part of winter, because in an age where every bit of warmth was precious, they accepted the risks in exchange for a night without freezing. If you lived in that time, do you think you could sleep peacefully on such a bed? Or would you lie awake at night listening to the sounds in the dark? Share your honest thoughts below. For medieval peasants, winter clothing wasn't a fashion choice. It was the only armor standing between them and cold that could numb their hands and feet in minutes outdoors. They wore 4 to 7 layers of coarse wool, each layer woven from minimally processed sheep's fiber, thick but stiff, warm yet rough enough to scrape the skin, leaving red streaks along shoulders and chest. On days working in the fields, the edges of the wool would harden from frost, rubbing so harshly that the skin bled, yet no one dared reduce the number of layers, because even a single draft seeping through could make the whole body shiver uncontrollably. The hardship didn't stop there. With clean water more precious than gold in winter, most wool garments went almost unwashed for 3 or 4 months. They accumulated sweat, dirt, and even fleas, creating a musty smell that people of the time considered normal, but which today would be almost unbearable. Yet it was precisely those heavy, layered clothes that saved them on sub-zero mornings, when even a strong gust of wind could bring down someone unprotected right in the frozen fields. Seeing the way they lived, it's impossible not to feel a mixture of awe and shudder, because to survive that winter, they had to accept small daily injuries as a normal part of life. In the medieval winter, food was not just a necessity. It was a test to see which families had prepared enough and who would collapse before spring returned. The dish appearing almost every day was the perpetual stew, simmering quietly on the stove, where everything, from wilted vegetables to the last scraps of dried meat, was added and stewed continuously week after week. On days when the temperature dropped too low, keeping the fire going was difficult, and the stew would turn slightly sour, giving off a strange smell. Yet people still had to eat it because they knew too well that discarding it meant going hungry. To supplement energy, they relied on turnips, carrots, dried onions, and rock-hard barley bread, things that could last for weeks in the earth cellar without spoiling. Dried river fish or smoked meat were rare treats, while fresh vegetables almost vanished entirely, forcing many to face the silent consequences of vitamin C deficiency. Swollen gums, sore mouths, and sometimes loose teeth from weeks of eating nothing but dried foods. Yet in that harshness, the stew became the center of the household, where people gathered at the end of the day to share a bit of warmth, a familiar taste, and a small hope that they would still have the strength to continue fighting through the long, endless winter. In the medieval winter, survival didn't rely solely on food and clothing. It also depended on tools that might seem ordinary, but could mean the difference between staying alive and being buried in snow. Every household had a large wooden shovel placed right by the door, not to keep the yard tidy, but because if snow fell all night, a single morning without clearing a path could trap the entire family inside. There are recorded cases where a broken shovel on the day a blizzard hit meant the victims couldn't escape and died from the cold in their own yard. To avoid getting lost while fetching water or checking livestock, they planted tall wooden stakes along pathways, each stake serving as a marker. In the whiteout of snow and wind, step even a few paces off the line, and one could disappear in the storm, as visibility sometimes dropped to only a few feet. Many tales tell of people just meters from home who still couldn't find their way back, only to be discovered after the blizzard passed, lying motionless on the snow. In addition, they used small tricks like warming stones and wrapping them in cloth to place under or inside beds, or stuffing fur around wrists and ankles to retain heat. These simple tools may sound basic, but they were the weapons people relied on to display their understanding of nature, in an era where even the smallest mistake could turn your name into a cautionary tale for the entire village for many winters to come. Perhaps the thing modern people least imagine about the medieval winter is that amid months so cold that every breath turned to ice, people still held ceremonies and festivals that at first glance seemed like occasions for celebration, but in reality carried much deeper meaning. As the longest nights of the year approached, villagers began preparing for Yule, an ancient tradition older than the medieval era itself, which was not a celebration of light, but a ritual to honor those who had not survived the winter. They believed that when the sun sank lowest, the boundary between the living and the dead became fragile, and wandering spirits needed to be soothed with rosemary, food, and, above all, a great fire lit in the center of the village. The Yule fire symbolized not just hope, but a challenge to the cold and darkness. People believed that if the fire went out too soon, the rest of the winter would be even harsher. As villagers gathered around the fire, they told stories, sang ancient songs, and shared small amounts of food as a reminder that no matter how fierce the blizzard, the community was the final shield protecting each family. Later, as Christianity spread, Yule merged with Christmas, but the old layers of meaning quietly persisted beneath hymns and formal ceremonies. Looking back, we see that these festivals did more than chase away fear. They kept the spirit of the entire village from being crushed by the endless cold. If any part of this tradition resonates with you, don't hesitate to share a comment below, and remember to subscribe to the channel to join the next historical journeys.